Welcome. I am Tom Schuster, and this is Christianity Unearthed, the 4,000-year rise and fall of Christianity. This is the winner's tale before Christianity became orthodoxy. Episode 3, Jerusalem, Roots, Rupture, and the First Struggles for Authority. In the beginning, there was no church, no bishops, no creeds, no canon, not even the idea that Jesus' followers were anything but Jews with a particular conviction about their teacher. They gathered in Jerusalem because that is where Jesus had died, and because that is where they believed God would act again. They prayed in the temple courts, recited the Psalms, read the prophets, and lived inside the rhythms of Jewish law. Nothing about their daily life distinguished them from the wider Jewish world, except for one belief, that God had begun his final work in the resurrection of Jesus. This conviction did not create a new religion. It sharpened an old hope. The earliest followers believed that Jesus' resurrection signaled the opening of the last chapter of history. They waited for his return, not as a distant possibility, but as an imminent event. They spoke of the Spirit moving among them, of visions that confirmed their expectation, of healings that felt like echoes of Jesus' ministry. They gathered in homes to break bread, gave what they had to one another, and lived as if the world were about to change. But time passed, and the world stayed the same. Rome still ruled. The community in Jerusalem grew older, and confusion began to mingle with conviction. Their difference placed them in an uncomfortable position. They were too committed to Jesus for some in the synagogue, too Jewish for the pagans of the city, and too small to matter politically. Yet their faith persisted. Jesus had risen, therefore God's future must be near. They did not think of themselves as founding anything. They were waiting for the kingdom, waiting for the vindication, waiting for God to finish what he had begun. And then history forced their hand. Earlier, a series of events had reshaped the landscape. Jesus had been crucified around the year 30 CE. 30 CE, or 30 Common Era, is the same as 30 AD or Anno Domini, executed under Roman authority. James the Just, a central figure in the Jerusalem group and the brother of Jesus, was killed in the early 60s. Peter and Paul, two apostles remembered as founders of communities across the Mediterranean, died during the reign of Nero around 64. In 66 CE, Judea had erupted in revolt against Roman rule. Jerusalem descended into civil strife. Different Jewish groups, priests, revolutionaries, aristocrats, zealots, turned on one another, even as Roman legions approached. In 70 CE, the Romans breached the city and destroyed the temple. The sacred center of Jewish life was gone. To understand what happened next, we need to pause and explain what the temple meant. For centuries, Judaism understood itself through a covenant, a sacred contract between God and the people of Israel. Each side had obligations. God's obligations were to protect Israel, preserve them in the land, and, most importantly, to safeguard the temple. Israel's obligations were to keep the Mosaic law, that is, the law of Moses. Circumcision, Sabbath observance, dietary laws, ethical commandments, and, at the core, temple sacrifice. The temple was not simply a building. It was the legal and spiritual center of the covenant. It was God's house, where his presence dwelled, the place where heaven touched earth, where Israel fulfilled its side of the agreement. When the temple fell, the sacrificial core of the covenant collapsed. There was no place to sacrifice, no place to perform atonement, no place to enact the rituals that structured Jewish identity. Large portions of Scripture assumed a functioning temple. For the followers of Jesus, still fully Jewish in practice and identity, this loss was not an abstract theological problem. It was the collapse of the world in which their faith had meaning. Without it, Judaism faced an unprecedented crisis. Before the revolt, the Sanhedrin was dominated by the priestly aristocracy, largely Sadducean, wealthy, and tied closely to temple authority. In the decades after the temple's destruction, Jewish life gradually reorganized around scripture, interpretation, and synagogue practice, with teachers from the Pharisaic tradition playing an increasingly influential role. This shift strengthened Jewish identity, but it also narrowed the space in which the Jewish followers of Jesus could remain within it. As boundaries of belief and practice hardened, the Jewish Christian movement was gradually pushed to the margins, not through expulsion, but through redefinition. And another 40 years later, a second revolt under Bar Kokhba ended in devastation. Jews were barred from Jerusalem entirely. Judea was renamed Syria-Palestina, invoking the ancient name of the Philistines as a way of erasing the Jewish link to the land. Any lingering link between the Jesus movement and its birthplace was severed. Judaism would survive by transforming into a text-centered, law-centered, synagogue-centered religion. The Jesus movement, which had worshipped in the temple, kept the law, and seen itself as part of Israel, felt the same shock. But it was both crisis and opportunity, forcing them to rethink what it meant to follow God without a temple. Between 70 and 100 CE, communities of Jesus followers began to write the first Gospels from oral accounts of Jesus' life and teaching, because memory could no longer be preserved through a single central community or living eyewitnesses. Christianity would survive by transforming in a different direction, towards memory, mission, interpretation, and eventually doctrine. Now that Jerusalem was broken, we follow the movement as it scatters. Some Jesus followers fled into the countryside. Others traveled east into Syria. Some returned north to Galilee. Later traditions, uncertain but revealing, claim that a group fled across the Jordan to a settlement called Pella. Whether literally true or not, the story captures the real effect. The Jerusalem community lost its position as the center. Without the temple, without James, without stability, leadership and authority shifted. New cities rose to prominence. Antioch, a diverse city of Jews and Gentiles, is where followers of Jesus were first labeled Christenoi, Christ people, by outsiders. It was a mixed community shaped by language and trade. Alexandria, the intellectual capital of the Eastern Mediterranean, invited interpretation. Jews there already read scripture in Greek. When Jesus' followers arrived, they entered a world of philosophy and allegory. Rome was a city of households, slaves, freed people, merchants. Its communities preserved stories of suffering under Nero that later gave the city symbolic authority. Each city added something different. Each reshaped the memory of Jesus according to its own needs. These centers would eventually collide outside the imperial world. Christianity had been born in a single city. Now it lived along the roads. With the movement dispersed, we turn to the moment when memory became text. For several decades, Jesus' story had been transmitted orally, spoken in homes, repeated in worship, taught by traveling apostles and leaders. But oral memory was fragile. Witnesses were dying, communities were scattered, interpretations multiplied. This is when the evangelists, the shapers of the Gospels, emerged. It is important to be clear. The Gospels were anonymous when first written. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were added in the next century when certain teachers wanted to anchor these texts to apostolic authority. The real authors' names are unknown. Mark likely wrote first, around the time of or shortly after the temple's destruction, about 70 to 75 CE. His account is urgent and apocalyptic, reflecting a world in crisis. Matthew and Luke use Mark as a base, expanding and reorganizing it for their own communities. They added teachings, stories, and genealogies to show Jesus' place in Israel's story. John, writing another 15 years later, reimagined Jesus in cosmic terms. His gospel begins not with a birth narrative, but with a declaration about the Word that existed before creation itself. These were not neutral biographies. They were theological portraits. To write a gospel was to choose which Jesus would endure. Some emphasized Jesus as a teacher who upheld the law. Some saw him as a prophet. Others saw him as divine wisdom, and others still as God's eternal word. And some maintained Jewish practices alongside belief in him. Others did not. Some stressed that he wanted his identity and miracles kept a secret. Others that he wanted it known. Memory fragmented into many paths, and all of them claimed continuity with the same man. Now that the movement has spread beyond Jerusalem and begun to create written memories of Jesus, we need to step back and look at the wider forest of early Christian diversity. By the end of the first century and into the early second, Christianity was not one thing. It was many things. And those many things existed side by side. To make sense of this, we must briefly define three categories that constantly appear in early sources. A disciple was a follower, a student, who learned a teacher's way of life. An apostle was someone sent out, usually with authority, to found or guide communities. An evangelist came to mean a narrator of Jesus' story, especially the authors of the written Gospels, although, as we noted earlier, the traditional names attached to those Gospels were assigned later. Some writers used his name to reshape his message. Others rejected him entirely. Elsewhere, new Gospels appeared under names like Peter, Thomas, Mary, and Judas. These texts came from communities that remembered Jesus differently, sometimes emphasizing hidden teachers, sometimes ethics, sometimes apocalyptic visions. Rome, which would later claim universal authority, was at this stage a minor community. In the east, in Judea, Syria, and Egypt, other larger groups flourished, whose memories were very different from what would later be called orthodoxy. The Roman Empire, viewing this scene from the outside, saw none of the nuance. Christians were simply one more minority group, unusual in their refusal to honor the gods, but not uniquely threatening. Sometimes they were harassed or punished. More often they were ignored. But still the movement grew. It cared for its own, widows, orphans, the poor, the sick. It spread along trade routes, carried by merchants, travelers, slaves, and artisans. It appealed particularly to those with little hope for a future, the slaves and the poor. It adapted to different ways of life, and it developed different languages of prayer and worship. Throughout the first 4 centuries, Jewish Christian communities continued in various regions, especially in the East, holding to a vision of Jesus that was more rooted in the law and in Israel's story than in later doctrinal frameworks. Its decline was not foreordained. It was shaped by war, displacement, marginalization, and eventually by the rise of forms of Christianity more suited to Greek and Roman culture. Recovering this early Jerusalem community restores depth to Christian origins. It reminds us that Christianity began not as a unified religion, but as a Jewish conversation about who Jesus was and what his life meant. And with that conversation, we now turn to another question, one that struck the movement immediately after Jesus' death. Who now led this community, and on what authority? This question takes us directly into the conflicting claims that shaped the earliest Christian leadership. To understand how leadership first formed in the Jesus movement, we have to return to the very earliest days after the crucifixion, around the year 30. When Jesus was executed, his disciples, those students who had followed him closely, gathered in confusion. Some returned to Galilee. Others stayed in Jerusalem. None went out to preach his gospel. Some claim visions of him alive. Others recalled teachings that now seem filled with a new meaning. But no matter how they interpreted these experiences, one issue confronted them immediately. Who leads now? In the years after Jesus' death, 3 figures emerged at the center of the movement in Jerusalem: James the Just, Peter, and John. Paul later refers to them as the pillars of the community. But even within this trio, James stood above the others. His authority was recognized not only in Jerusalem, but across the scattered groups of Jesus followers. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus describes him as the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, whose name was James. Later Christian tradition, uncomfortable with the idea that Jesus had biological siblings, because it conflicted with the developing doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity, reinterpreted these brothers as cousins. But Josephus' statement is our earliest and clearest description. James appears to have been skeptical during Jesus' lifetime, yet after the crucifixion he emerged as the sober leader of the Jerusalem community. He lived an ascetic life, fasting, praying, keeping the Mosaic law with remarkable rigor. Some early traditions portray him almost as an unofficial priest, entering the temple daily for prayer. He represented continuity. For James, following Jesus did not break with Judaism, it fulfilled it. Peter had been one of Jesus' earliest disciples. He was charismatic, bold, sometimes erratic, a man capable of great insight one moment and deep failure the next. The Gospels remember him as the first to proclaim Jesus as Messiah, but also the one who denied him in the final hours. After Jesus' death, Peter traveled widely, to Joppa, to Antioch, and according to later tradition, eventually to Rome. He preached, healed, received visions, and testified publicly to the resurrection. John appears more quietly in the sources, associated with seniority and memory. For a time, these roles coexisted. Then Paul entered the picture. Paul had not known Jesus during his lifetime. His understanding came from a visionary experience and from his interpretation of Scripture. He believed that Jesus' death and resurrection had altered the terms of belonging. Gentiles, Paul argued, could enter the movement without circumcision, without dietary law, without becoming Jews. This was not a technical disagreement. It cut to the heart of identity. For the Jerusalem community, the law was God's covenant with Israel. Fidelity to it was not optional, it was mandatory. For Paul, requiring Gentiles to observe the law undermined the very meaning of the gospel he preached. Every clash between Paul and Jerusalem flows from this single fault line. Paul was a diaspora Jew from Tarsus, trained as a Pharisee, immersed in Scripture, and fiercely devoted to the traditions of his ancestors. He never met Jesus during Jesus' lifetime. His understanding of Jesus came from a single post-resurrection vision in the year 35 that he alone witnessed, and from what he had learned through the movement's communities. Paul knew very little about Jesus' teachings or daily life. He rarely quotes them and never appeals to the stories later preserved in the Gospels. For Paul, the meaning of Jesus lay almost entirely in his death and resurrection, which he saw as God's decisive act to bring Gentiles into the covenant without the Mosaic law. James, Peter, and John, by contrast, had known Jesus during his ministry. They were shaped by the apocalyptic Judaism of the Galilee, a world that expected God to intervene in history, vindicate Israel, judge the nations, and establish justice on earth. For them, Jesus was the Messiah of Israel, whose resurrection marked the beginning of the end times, and whose return was expected soon. They continued to keep the Mosaic law, worship at the temple, and maintain Jewish communal life. Paul and the Jerusalem leaders were shaped by different experiences, different assumptions, and different visions of what God was doing. Paul believed that Gentiles could join the movement without circumcision, without dietary restrictions, and without becoming Jews, because Jesus' death had nullified the law as a boundary. James, Peter, and John believed that God's covenant with Israel remained in force, and that fidelity to the Mosaic law was part of following Jesus. They saw Jesus as God's Messiah restoring Israel. Paul saw Jesus as God's universal Christ, opening the covenant to the nations. This difference, law or no law for Gentiles, lay at the heart of every clash between Paul and Jerusalem. Paul's own letters, written decades before the book of Acts, all of which are found in the New Testament, preserve the conflict as it unfolded. It was not a disagreement about Jesus, but about what belonging meant. Paul tells us that, quote, "After 3 years, I went to Jerusalem to visit Cephas," that's Peter, "and stayed with him 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother." He emphasizes what did not happen. He insists he received no instruction. He stresses independence. Acts, written later, describes harmony and welcome. Paul's own words suggest something more cautious: recognition without endorsement. A decade later, the issue returned with force. Paul went again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas and Titus, a Gentile convert. Titus became a test case. Paul writes that Titus, quote, "was not compelled to be circumcised." The phrasing matters. It implies pressure. Paul speaks of, another quote, false brothers secretly brought in, who insisted the law be kept in full. He never names them, but the position aligns them with those closest to James. A compromise was reached. Paul would continue among the Gentiles, the Jerusalem leaders among the Jews. Acts presents this as a resolution. Paul presents it as negotiation. The disagreement remained. The consequences of this unresolved tension became visible in Antioch. Antioch is where Paul started his mission. He stayed there many years, making and selling leather tents. He spread his concept of Jesus to Gentiles and Jews alike. There, Jews and Gentiles ate together. Table fellowship was not symbolic, it was the center of community life. To eat together was to recognize equality before God. At first, Peter joined the Gentiles. Then Paul tells us, quote, certain men came from James. Peter withdrew. Paul describes the moment precisely. Peter succumbed to the pressure from these men from Jerusalem. He withdrew from the company of these uncircumcised men and did not eat the unclean food with them anymore. Others followed his lead. Even Barnabas was carried along. Paul confronted Peter publicly. This was not about food, it was about belonging. Peter stood between two worlds. Paul would not yield. Jerusalem could not either. The movement did not resolve the conflict. It learned to live with it. This entire episode, the most important internal conflict in early Christian history, disappears from Acts. Acts was written by someone who very clearly did not know Paul. The later church tried to solve this embarrassment by claiming that the author was Luke the physician, Paul's loyal traveling companion. But that attribution only appears a century later. It is tradition, not history. Acts presents harmony, shared mission, calm deliberation, and agreements reached in orderly fashion. Paul's letters show something very different: confrontation, pressure, suspicion, competing centers of authority, and a movement struggling to define itself. Paul's language in his letters is unforgettable. Quote, when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. Acts, by contrast, describes the outcome in much gentler terms. Quote, there was great joy among the brothers. Acts writes a past suitable for a later, unified church. Paul writes from inside the events as they unfolded. The tension did not lie between James and Peter. It lay in how their different kinds of authority and Paul's radically inclusive mission would shape the communities coming into being. So why did some people believe and others not? At this point, a question naturally arises. Why would some people come to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead when most other Jews did not? The answer is not that the belief was self-evident. It was not. Most Jews rejected it. They rejected it not because they denied God's power, but because resurrection was expected at the end of history as a collective event. If only one person is raised ahead of time, while the rest of the world remained unchanged, that made little sense. For those who rejected the claim, Jesus' execution looked like failure, not vindication. But belief did not begin as an abstract claim. It began with experiences. Some of Jesus' followers became convinced that they had encountered him after death, in visions, appearances, or overwhelming experiences of presence. Interpreted through Jewish categories, these experiences pointed not to metaphor, but to resurrection. Grief, expectation, and hope shaped interpretation. Ancient people did not divide reality into natural and supernatural in modern terms. God acting in history was not implausible. The question was meaning. Once belief took root inside a community, it was reinforced through shared meals, prayer, scripture, and repetition. It did not feel false to those who held it. It felt explanatory. Others disagreed, and continued to disagree. Judaism did not collapse into Christianity. Christianity remained a minority movement within Judaism for decades. Acts does not preserve the confrontation at Antioch. Instead, it offers a narrative of calm deliberation and collective agreement. The difference is not accidental. Acts was written for a time 50 to 60 years later, when unity mattered more than transparency. Paul writes from inside the tension, in the moment. Acts writes after the fact. Different moments produce different kinds of memory. To understand why James mattered and why Peter's role created such tension, we need to step back and look carefully at what the earliest Jesus movement actually believed. The first followers of Jesus were not Christians in the later sense. They were Jews responding to a Jewish message offered by a Jewish teacher inside a Jewish framework. This group, sometimes called the Nazarenes, or those of the way, believed three core things. Jesus was the Messiah, the Anointed One promised to Israel. Secondly, God had raised him from the dead, signaling the start of the end times. Thirdly, the law of Moses still applied, because God's covenant with Israel remained in force. For them, Jesus had not abolished the law, he had fulfilled it, and if anything, intensified his commands to follow it. Their worldview was apocalyptic, meaning they believed God would soon intervene in history to restore justice, defeat evil, and vindicate the righteous. Nothing about their belief implied a new religion. They did not worship Jesus as God. They honored him as the Messiah, a divinely authorized human figure chosen by God to restore Israel. This framework appears in several early texts. The letter of James, traditionally linked to James the Just, though likely written later by disciples who carried his memory, emphasizes ethical behavior and says almost nothing that portrays Jesus as divine. The Gospel of Mark, the earliest narrative of Jesus' life, was written for a Torah-observant Jewish community. It does not call Jesus God. It calls him Messiah. Matthew, drawing heavily on Scripture, presents Jesus as a new Moses and insists that not one jot or tittle of the law will pass away. The Didache, a Jewish Christian community manual from Syria, preserves prayers, ethical teachings, and ritual instructions rooted in synagogue tradition. These texts show continuity, not rupture. They show a movement still located inside Judaism, even after the temple's destruction forced new questions. This Jewish Christian core was not small. It remained influential for another 3 centuries, long after later traditions tried to minimize it. Jewish Christianity did not disappear. Later tradition often gives the impression that Paul's position triumphed quickly and universally. The evidence does not support that picture. Jewish Christian groups persisted for centuries, especially in the East. Communities known as Ebionites, Nazarenes, and Elkosites maintained Torah observance, rejected Paul's theology, and honored Jesus as Messiah without identifying him as God. They were not marginal in the first centuries, they were part of the movement's living diversity. Their eventual decline reflects political, cultural, linguistic, and administrative pressures, not theological refutation. Now we return to the problem of Peter. Because to understand how leadership shifted from Jerusalem to the wider world, we need to understand how Peter's memory was shaped, reshaped, and eventually transformed. Peter's name echoes across Christian history, but the portraits we possess are far from unified. In the earliest gospel, Mark, Peter is bold but flawed, confessing Jesus as Messiah, yet misunderstanding repeatedly and ultimately denying him in the final hours. Matthew portrays him as a foundation stone, the rock, yet also as someone requiring correction. Luke emphasizes him as a witness in Jerusalem, but John recasts him as a shepherd commissioned after the resurrection. Paul, writing earlier than the Gospels, describes Peter, whom he calls Cephas, as someone he both respected and confronted, particularly over the question of whether Gentile believers needed to follow Jewish dietary laws. These are not consistent portraits, they are literary constructions, interpretations shaped by different communities' needs. In the 2nd century, Peter's image grew even more complex. Letters were written under his name, sayings were attributed to him, stories placed him in cities he may never have visited. Competing groups invoked him to validate their teachings. And then came Rome. Rome claimed Peter as its founding apostle, not primarily because of historical evidence, which is thin and conflicting, but because Peter's symbolic power was immense. Rome needed an apostolic figure to legitimize its growing authority, and Peter, with his complex story and martyrdom legend, became the perfect candidate. The claim that Peter died in Rome, whether historically accurate or not, eventually became the foundation for the city's ecclesiastical prestige. It allowed Rome to present itself as the heir to apostolic authority, even as its own theological trajectory departed from the earliest Jewish Christian ways. In this sense, Peter's memory became a battleground. He was not just a person, he was a symbol, reshaped to justify competing visions of authority as the movement expanded. If Jewish Christian groups persisted for centuries, why did they eventually decline? Why did they fade from the center of the story? Several pressures converged. The destruction of the temple and again the devastation of the Bar Kokhba revolt 65 years later scattered Jewish populations and destroyed Jerusalem as a Jewish city. Communities that had been rooted in a specific place were displaced. After the revolts, Jewish customs, Sabbath observance, circumcision, dietary law became politically risky in many Roman cities. Jewish identity was increasingly seen as rebellious or suspect. As the movement spread into Greek and Latin-speaking regions, Torah-observant communities were at a cultural disadvantage. The intellectual and social world of the empire did not revolve around texts in Hebrew or Aramaic. Proto-Orthodox communities used Greek, the language of administration and philosophy, which allowed their writings to circulate more widely. Jewish Christian groups tended to preserve traditions on scrolls. Proto-Orthodox groups adopted the Codex, an early form of the book, invented at the end of the 1st century, easier to copy, easier to transport, easier to canonize. It also changed the concept of a canon. A basket of scrolls has no order, no table of contents. Scrolls can be added or removed without notice. A bound book is different. Its order and content has permanence. This seemingly technical shift changed how communities understood their text, what belonged inside the covers, what lay outside, and who had the authority to decide. Communities that aligned with Roman administration, using Greek, adopting codices, forming networks of bishops, gained influence as the empire took notice. Those that remained closer to Jewish life and law were gradually pushed to the margins. But, and this is important, they were not extinguished by theological weakness. They were squeezed out by history, politics, culture, language, and empire. Their theology, emphasizing Jesus' humanity, ethical life, obedience to God's law, and the hope of the kingdom, lived on in texts like the Didache, the Epistle of James, and in countless communities whose names we no longer know. Jewish Christianity faded as an organized force after Constantine, but its DNA remained woven into the earliest layers of the tradition. We have walked from the earliest Jesus followers in Jerusalem through the trauma of the temple's destruction into the first struggles over leadership and identity. James, rooted in law, temple, and continuity, represented the earliest way of following Jesus. Peter, traveling, charismatic, missionary, represented the movement's expansion. Their conflicts were not failures. They were the forming tensions of a community without a map. From this contested beginning, the movement spread outward, carrying multiple memories of Jesus, memories that would later shape and be shaped by the regions it entered. And as Jerusalem recedes into the background, a new city rises to the foreground. Antioch, the first place where Jews and Gentiles tried to live together as followers of Jesus. The first place where the word Christian was used, and the place where the internal diversity of the movement became unmistakable. You are listening to Season 1 of The Winner's Tale. This has been Episode 3. From Jerusalem's fracture, the movement flows north into a cosmopolitan world where a new question takes shape. What happens when Jews and Gentiles try to live this story together? This will test its identity for the first time.